Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.
And welcome to this episode of the Yogananda podcast, where we break down the autobiography of a yogi line by line. Now, for those who have been following, I'm sure you'll know we've departed from chapter 4, and we are now beginning a new chapter, chapter 5, titled "A Perfumed Saint Displays His Wonders." So we're pretty excited. We're all pretty pumped about this, the beginning of this chapter. I think we're talking before the podcast started. So there's a lot to break down. We're going to try to do our best to break down, go into detail on every line that we'll come across. Now, Priyank, do you want to?
Yeah, we're also pretty excited because we're starting a new chapter as the four of us, because now we've actually met. Three of you have met in person. So this may change the dynamic for all those that are very detailed, intuitive, focused in terms of dynamics.
Yeah, you say that, but I think the thing that, Lauren and I sort of mentioned a couple of times, and my takeaway was that it didn't feel like we were meeting for the first time. I know we gave each other a big hug and had a big hug and embrace, but it felt like we'd been friends for a long time, right?
Mm.
So my theory, my hypothesis is that it probably won't change anything, but but the eagle-eyed observer or keen listener might pick up something. So yes, good point, Priyank, well raised. So we're going to read, for those who do want to read along with us. Please feel free to pause the podcast, and you can read up to, we're going to try to cover this today, up to after you leave here today, an unusual experience will come your way. So that's going to be the line that we're going to stop at today. And we're going to cover the footnotes and all the material that we can do in the time roughly that we have allotted. So do feel free to pause, read up to there, or listen if you're on the Audible book, which is excellent, by the way. I did listen to the whole chapter again, just as a refresher on the Audible book, and it's just fantastic to listen to. Quite short, actually, even though we're going to cover, how many minutes are we going to cover on this podcast, same chapter, probably 10 times, well, much more than 10 times the amount. So let's kick off then with the chapter title and expectations as to what we're going to cover in this chapter. Perfumed Saint Displays His Wonders. It's a really unique title, as all the titles in the autobiography are unique. But this one sort of stands out as a very intriguing, thought-provoking title. Perfumed Saint. When I first read that, I don't know why it stuck in my mind had such an impression to my mind when I first read it, but there's something very playful about it, isn't there? And mysterious. And I think the mysteriousness of it sort of captivates what this chapter represents for me. And in this part of the chapter in particular, it is filled with riddles itself, and there's a sadhu or a rishi that we're going to talk about in detail, and he's full of great insights, but it is very mystical, this part of the book in this chapter. So we're going to have that to look forward to. I'll come to you, Lauren, now.
Firstly, I am so excited to be doing this part of the chapter. It's great. But even the title, I realize, has some sort of, not even some sort of, it has a lot of depth and also some curiosity, because it says displays his wonders. And initially one might think, does that mean the saint's wonders? Or is he talking about God's wonders as it's all capitalized?
Oh, yeah.
And it raises an interesting question, even before we begin the chapter. So looking forward to delving in.
Having read the chapter, which his do you think it is? His.
I feel that it's his as God, because nothing can be owned. Everything is he. So if it's flowing from, it must be God in himself. What do you think, Mike?
Wouldn't it have to be capital his then, if it's his wonders?
Yeah,
It
it is
is.
capital.
It
But
is capital
all-
his.
Mm.
Okay,
all titles, I think, in this book
then we
are,
know the answer.
No,
well,
no,
no,
all,
because
yeah.
all words are capitalized in titles in the book.
Oh, okay, so we
Ah,
don't know the answer.
yeah,
Oh
but
no.
I mean-
Okay.
Intrigued.
Okay. So mystery is good. We
Mhm.
need to can't solve all the riddles.
Did.
Yeah, it's kind of the theme for this episode in some ways. Well, we're going to get into detail. We don't want to reveal too much too soon as to our key takeaways for this part of the chapter. But it is very fun, very fast moving. Yogananda really pulls the reader in extremely quickly. With an amazing first line that we'll talk about. But he does talk to a mystical rishi, a greedy acquaintance, and then the perfume saint himself. So we'll look at the nature of God, the complexities of the world, and the pursuit of his spiritual understanding, and much more. So let's delve into it then. First line. This is really Yogananda seeking guidance in this part of the Autobiography of a Yogi, and the first line really is a quote from the Bible. From Ecclesiastes. I said it wrong. Ecclesiastes. I've practiced
The
like
only
20
reason I know
times.
how to
I still
say that
it
is
wrong.
because our insurance provider at the centre was ecclesiastical.
Oh yes, ecclesiastical. Yeah,
and they do churches.
right. Yeah. So the Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 of the King James version is quoted here in the Autobiography of a Yogi. And we know Yogananda is very fond of studying the Bible. He did it extensively, which I love personally. He's taking the wisdom that's available to him there. Before I go on, Priyank, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and we are taught to read the King James version. If we're going to read one, then that's the one SRF. What's the word? Not recommend. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't
Go
know
to.
that.
Is that
Ah,
because that's the one simply that Yogananda studied himself? That's the one that he quotes often.
No. Well, actually, I don't know, but the most closely translation is the closest to the actual meaning, I think, is the
I see.
summary.
Makes
Wow.
sense. Good. So the quote itself says, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." Now, you could probably just do a whole podcast on that one sentence, but Yogananda simply goes on to say here that he didn't have this, this wisdom of Solomon, King Solomon, who there's a footnote 2 that we will talk about briefly in a moment. And he's essentially trying to captivate here this moment in time for Yogananda, where he was searching for his guru. He says that 2 years had elapsed between the flight with Amar to toward the Himalayas and the day that he met his own guru, Sri Yukteswar. And he's insinuating here that as we're going to analyze like what this statement means to everything, that there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. He maybe was a bit impatient. So he wanted to meet his guru. And he says here in this part that he was constantly looking for the face of his guru, and he gazed searchingly about him on he says, any excursion from home for the face of his guru. So this was always on his mind. So the insinuation really here, from what I gather, is that patience, knowing that God has a plan, that you want to surrender. There's a purpose to everything. You simply want to observe rather than learn, and learn, rather than force things to come before the allotted time that maybe God has planned for it. And it does remind me of one of my favorite sort of sayings, which is, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And so this kind of comes to mind where, Yogananda is simply really pushing, trying to find his guru, but it's going to come. you have to sort of sit back and wait to some extent. And that we are not the doers comes to mind here as well. That God is ultimately the doer, and we're living through His will and His grace. But Priyank, can I come to you for comments?
Sure. That first line, to everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. It's got as you say, that you could do a podcast about it, but it's very poetic and very pleasing to the ear, isn't it? And Ecclesiastes, a lot of it is in that same sort of vein, in the poetic language that it uses and rhymes and things like that. But I really means when you read some lines, you may not understand them, but you get this deep feeling of this has to be a really important line. And I got that from this line. I still remember, and when I reread it for this podcast again, I got that same feeling that I got the first time. But it's quite a profound line, isn't it? There's tones of like, that everything has a purpose. There's a meaning to actually everything in life, and the timing of all of that links to kind of like karma and destiny and those kinds of things. But it's actually the next line is quite revealing for what this section also means. The next line of Ecclesiastes, which is so the next line is, there's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. It's just like, could you not? You couldn't get a more karma-centric biblical line, could you? And that in the Old Testament.
We're going to touch on Kali in the next part of what we're going to read, and interestingly, her role. She had a kind of strong part to play in this cycle of life, and her role, her assigned role, and what she is the symbol of being sort of death and various things. So we're going to. I don't want to talk about that prematurely, but it is so interlinked, isn't it? And Yogananda does such a good job with, line after line, paragraph after paragraph, just syncing everything together. It's really beautiful, isn't it? Mike, I'll come to you.
Yeah, we shouldn't forget we're just coming off the back of the last chapter 4, where he ran away to the Himalayas, and it seemed a bit like this was a venture that, he got some out of it. He heard a story about a saint, but it didn't really fulfill his desire for a guru. And then he could have just pulled a saying or figure of speech or something, but instead he pulls this really nice quote from the Old Testament, right? Which is very fitting.
And I'd highly recommend reading the rest of book 3 of Ecclesiastes. It's really, really good, really poetic, and kind of just carries on in that same vein. It's quite nice.
Nice. So we have this very poetic beginning, and it's just the preamble for what's to come, because I do like my poetry, but I find that I think maybe Priyank, you said in the previous episode, like it takes time to read certain poems and certain poets' writings, because you have to just break it down and meditate on each line. And I almost feel like that's actually what we have in store for us in just this part of the autobiography of a yogi. And going back to what Yogananda says here, he mentions, it's been 2 years since his time that he was trying to last run to the Himalayas with his friend, his accomplice. But during that time, up until this point to which he's brought us to, he met with a number of sages, and he's done it in this very eloquent way, where he's mentioned the perfume saint that we're going to talk about in this chapter 5, Tiger Swami, that's going to be covered in chapter 6, Najendra Nath Baduri, also known as the levitating saint, in chapter 7, and then Master Messiah that we talked about, or that we will talk about in chapter 9, but that was the Sanskrit tutor. that was previously known as Swami Kabbalananda, that we discussed in the previous chapter, chapter 4. And then we have in chapter 8, the famous Bengali scientist, Jagadish Chandra Bose. So he's covered 5 chapters there, by just mentioning in these 2 years, he's met all of these people. And there's 5 chapters in the Autobiography of a Yogi dedicated to these various encounters that he's had. So these 2 years that he's had are very formative. They're very important to Yogananda, and therefore us in our study of Yogananda's life and what it means to us and the teachings that Yogananda is bringing to us. So just in that one short paragraph, he's saying, hey, I've met all these people in the last 2 years, and they obviously impacted him very, very greatly. So we'll go into those in more detail in future chapters, and they're all great, aren't they? Every single chapter that we have to pull apart. Priyank?
Yeah, very much. It gives us a teaser for what's to come, especially if you hadn't read the contents and you didn't know what the titles of the chapters were, especially the Tiger Swami, for example. Like, what's that going to be about? But when he refers to Nagendranath Baduri, he doesn't say levitating saint, he says the name. Interesting. Whereas in the chapter, I think he says, does he not, that is a levitating saint?
Yeah.
He mentions both,
yes, he
right?
does. The levitating saint, and then in brackets, Nagendranath Baduri.
Yeah. So he's teasing us here with his plan, how he's structuring everything so beautifully and poetically. Mike?
I assume everyone was most excited to get to the Tiger Swami when you heard this list, right? Because this just sounds like an interesting chapter.
Yeah, and this definitely is going to be next chapter. Don't know how many time episodes going to be for us to get there.
Yeah, to be honest, mine was the levitating saint. So I don't know what that says about me, but the levitating saint, my mind just raced when I first saw that. So yeah, it's there's a lot to look forward to, and he just drops them all very neatly into one paragraph here for us that he covered in 2 years. So it was obviously a very busy couple of years for Yogananda, and very formative for him. But first, before we move on, we did mention that we have the great King Solomon is referenced by Yogananda here. Maybe Priyank, you could tell us a little bit more about the great Solomon.
Yes, so he's a Jewish king back then. So the whole of the book of Ecclesiastes is basically his narrations. So it's essentially his wisdom, and he's always portrayed as or known as the the wealthy and the wise and the powerful, and not powerful in the sense of just military power or wealth power, because there's a really nice story about him amongst in the Bible, which is like apparently he sacrificed something to God, and God later appeared to him in a dream and asked Solomon what he wanted in return for that sacrifice, what gift. And Solomon asked for wisdom in order to better rule and guide his people, which is a pretty cool thing for a king to ask for, as opposed to jewels and more empire and things like that. But apparently God was then pleased and answered Solomon's prayer and gave him great wisdom, because he didn't ask for self-serving rewards like long life or death of his enemies.
Yeah, worthy of future study. Whenever I heard Solomon years ago, I always thought it was like a made-up person, because Sol, on, like these three, you break down the words, that I thought it was more of the personification of the sun and the wisdom that the sun brings. So I wonder if there's any listeners who can shed some light on that for me, because I didn't get the chance to do the research into that. But if it was indeed a great king, as Yogananda himself has said here, in the footnotes, so I do take that as gospel. His wisdom stood the test of time, and we're still talking about him today. So what a good reference there from Yogananda to make us aware of. Yogananda then delves into the real main aspect of this part of the chapter. Before I go on, sorry, Priyank, do you want to say something more?
That line where he says, his encounter with the perfume saint had two elements. He said one was harmonious and the other was humorous. Obviously, it's a really good play of alliteration there for the reader. But we know which one the harmonious was because we're going to talk about it here. But which one was the humorous one? Was the humorous one the one where he met that friend or family member that kept talking? Or was it the actual perfume saint, which he found frustrating, probably even funny because of his ridiculous use of God-given powers? I don't know which of the ones which of the two do you think he's referring to in terms of humorous?
Well, I think by purpose of elimination, you could say that the first one wasn't quite harmonious because he was trying to get away. We'll talk about this in a moment, but his friend that he bumps into.
No, the harmonious one was the true saint that has all this profound philosophy. That's definitely I think that's the harmonious one. Of course. So the humorous one is the one that's debatable. Is which of the two, the big speaker or the weird magician?
Yeah, good point. I don't think he kind of referenced anything as humorous, but I think he did challenge the second one. So I'll go with it.
Maybe by the end of this episode, we can come back to that and we'll see which one we think it was.
Yeah, it's a good call. I wasn't sure when I first read that, so I skipped over. So yeah, you caught me on that, which is good. So here we have the main part of this part of the chapter that we're going to talk about. And this is the meeting that Yogananda has, this harmonious meeting, as we maybe have just deduced, that Yogananda has with a rishi, a great seer. And I just thought, wow, isn't this typical, of an avatar coming into this world, and he's drawing all of these great experiences towards him. He's meeting these, people of very high enlightenment, and he's able to sort of relay these stories to us. So we get that glimpse into what Yogananda's life was like, this, very, very synchronous life that he has. So he's standing in front of a temple, Kali Temple, and into his ear is, I suppose, whispered slightly, spoken into his ear quietly, is God is simple, everything else is complex. Do not seek absolute values in the relative world of nature. And that is a line to drop, isn't it? To what was a stranger, really. Yogananda, he hasn't said that he's met this individual before that we're about to talk about, but that is a line and a half that, again, you could probably sit for a long time and meditate on, try to pull lots of knowledge, wisdom from. Priyank, what's your take on it?
Oh, so you haven't just whispered random bits of truth like that to people, like in the church and things like
that? I think it's probably beyond me, at the moment, to come up with such profound insights, let alone
say ones which you don't even understand. Be like, I think therefore I am, and just walk away.
All there is love, Yeah, one day I'll do it for pranks.
I think when Guruji is following us through our lives and he looks at us doing certain things, he probably constantly tries to whisper something to us, some words of wisdom. We're in tune, we can hear them.
Listen to the voice in the back of the mind.
But this line is it hits home for me because I'm absolutist. I'd like to deal with absolutes. Being of the physical sciences background, we deal with absolutes and not probabilities. So and then when anyone ever gives me like a woolly answer, are really, passionately seek the absolute answer, not the maybe, the yes or the no, or the 1 or the 0.
I can relate a bit, even though I'm not a real engineer, but I know in math is so abstract that a lot of things are absolute or seem absolute, at least in math. And then when you apply math on nature, then it becomes physics, right? And physics is already a lot less absolute, especially when you go into quantum physics. And there's a few different fields where things happen and we go like, this is not right, but we don't know why it's the case. And I'm guessing our whole life is a bit like quantum physics, right? And if we try to use our intellect to find absolutes with it, we will just never be satisfied.
Well, Einstein didn't like the quantum world, did he? He used to say, God does not throw dice.
Yeah.
It's actually really interesting hearing both of you talk about this, because I love how you perceived it, and it just goes to show how everyone takes something different from truth, which is interesting in itself, because truth is absolute, right? But when I read it, to me it feels like he's saying, do not seek the absolute values, as in the absolute reflection of God and his values in this relative sphere, this realm of nature. Like, how often do we seek the values and nature of God in humans, for example, and we fall short because, alas, it cannot be. So that's kind of how I soaked it in, that it meant, do not seek for the absolute God in nature, in this reality. But like you say, it's so multifaceted, isn't it? Makes you wonder. You could really delve into this for a long time.
Yeah, I think you're probably quite right there, actually, Lauren. That's roughly what I took from it as well. And there's a quote that I want to read out separately for Yogananda, who talked about it. But just on what Priyank and Mike said, Priyank, that's probably why we get on so well, Priyank, is that chalk and cheese attracts. It's kind of goes together, and probably the opposite. I like these, abstract and slightly non-committal, realities that it's a little bit more artistic as opposed to the raw mathematical, conclusions of things. Let's say that you can draw. Lauren.
And there's so many lessons in this chapter, isn't there? And I feel like this first sort of section, even this one line, is a whole lesson in itself. God is simple. Everything else is complex. Like that alone is an instruction, isn't it? How often do we get lost in the complexities of life, when we should just focus on the simplicity of God.
Mike.
That kind of is a really good point to bring it back to that, because I guess our soul is looking for certain things in life and just can't find it, right? It's looking for perfect love. It's looking for perfect values. And the only place where it will be satisfied is in God and nowhere else, right?
Yes.
Exactamente. That's part of the quote from Yogananda. So you've been doing your reading, Mike. It's just coming out of you. All these years of studying what Yogananda says, part and parcel. But yeah, that's it. And Yogananda himself, I thought, responded pretty well. But he did say that he recognized the truth, what this sadhu was saying. But before we get on to that, he did say something quite funny here. I wondered, how do you spot a sadhu? Can anybody answer? If you were walking down the street, could you spot a sadhu at first glance? Well, Yogananda describes this. He said he confronted, turning, he confronted the tall man whose garb or lack of it revealed him a wandering sadhu. So he's saying that therein that he could identify the man as a sadhu because there was a lack of garb. I wonder just how much of a lack, but they've been known to even have no garb at all. Some of them that do Roman in India. I don't know if is that a bit of an issue actually, not with the modern way of living, that it's maybe certain like indecent exposure. I don't think you could get away with that in the UK, but it's maybe accepted in some parts of India, maybe still. But certainly Yogananda here, with a bit of humor, sort of throws that in. And he says really that his thoughts were bewildered. And he said that the rishi had penetrated his thoughts. And he smiled. So the two of them immediately struck a good chord with each other. And Yogananda described his confusion of benign and terrible aspects of nature, symbolized by Kali, whose temple they were standing in front of, had puzzled him and had maybe puzzled wiser heads than his, is how he put it. And I thought that was actually really, one very full of humility, really, from Yogananda, an avatar, somebody with great insight, was standing there sort of perplexed, bewildered, confused, puzzled. He's using these terms, this language, to describe his own musings as he sort of looked there and gazed upon Kali. Maybe that's a good time now to talk about Kali and what she represented in the figure. But Priyank, I'll come to you first if you have any comments.
Yeah, so you guys have probably seen the image of Kali, pretty ferocious forearms and standing on Shiva, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But I was just wondering, does that image of Divine Mother in that ferocious way, or in the four-armed way, blue skin, etc., or in the temple, the Dakshineshwar temple, like black stone is the is the statue made from? Does that actually, is anyone attracted to that form?
I feel like now I am, but I remember when I saw it for the first time. Actually, the first time I traveled to India in 2007, my background knowledge wasn't that great, and when I knew of Kali, I know Guruji talked about Kali many times, and then when I saw the actual statue, I was like, this can't be right. This is very strange. And I remember that I had this impression, and it stuck with me. And it's only over time that I actually understood what I don't know. It became more normal to me. I guess that's when I first saw it, I did not, because I grew up Christian. So for me, Divine Mother was always like Mother Mary or something like this, and it was just so different from that. I guess that's why.
Yeah, I think that's a good addition there, Mike. It's perspective, isn't it? I think if I shown my own mother, Kali, she was probably recoil. She's a Roman Catholic and has many different saints, and none of them really would have that element in that aspect. There's that death and destruction that sort of comes with the imagery of Kali with blood-soaked hands and weaponry and things like that. It's a very stark image, and when you grow up with the Western sort of culture of Christianity, it's shocking. And I think the mind, not necessarily mine, but the mind of a typical Christian, I think, would jump to lots of conclusions, and none of them all that positive. I think looking at something like this, that you're worshiping all sorts of gods, whereas the monotheistic idea of Christianity is a very stark contrast in it. So no, I'm very much used to it myself, but it wouldn't be something, to answer your question, Frank, that I would be immediately drawn to. But again, I'm probably programmed in lots of different ways.
Indeed, that's part of the value of India, actually, because God isn't put into this absolute box of someone who looks like Jesus or Virgin Mary. You can they're just normal in the sense that you can relate to them because you have a mother that may look like Virgin Mary, you have a father or grandfather that may look like Christ. But there's other gods, obviously, in India which are equally strange to behold. One of them is Hanuman, which is the elephant god. sorry, not the elephant god, the monkey god. And the other one is Ganesh or Ganpati, which is the elephant-headed god. Another one is Narasimha, which is elephant, it's a lion face and body of a human. So these are very strange forms of God, or depictions of God. And Mukunda here says, he's bewildered by it, and he's a child of an Indian origin. So myself and he shouldn't be bewildered by it, but to this day I am bewildered by it. But it's all in this line, isn't it? God is simple, everything else is complex. Don't seek absolute values in the relative world of nature. And India's really encapsulates that. So they don't fit God into this box of blue eyes and long wavy hair and attractive face. I mean, we do have that, obviously, but we also have these other forms which are much more difficult to comprehend, because God isn't comprehensible, right? And you guys may not find that form attractive, but there are many people that do find it attractive. I mean, the lion-faced god that I mentioned, Narasimha Bhagwan, he's one of the incarnations of Vishnu. And one of the I saw a documentary about this one devotee that's the only form of divinity that he aspires to. So he's gone out and become a archaeologist, and he's trying to find the ancient temples of Narasimha, and he's like the only one, because so few people are interested in this specific subgenre in Hinduism. But he's just out there digging on hills and mountains where he was supposed to have had his pastimes.
When I had the great fortune of staying with you, Parag, for a few nights, it was lovely, and you've got a great little library of books there, on yoga and various things. And one of them I was reading did talk about Kali and the story of Kali. So yeah, you might be able to recall and recount this better than I can. But in it was saying that in the beginning, death was not created, so that there was an overpopulation on planets or on the universe. And as such, at the time there was a lot of suffering, and it continues obviously. But to alleviate the overpopulation issue, Kali was given the responsibility for death. So she reluctantly had to accept, and Shiva, I think, stepped in to do something to sort of persuade her to sort of take up this role. I think that was somewhat of the backstory, which I found fascinating. To read. It was the first time I've come across anything like that before. Yeah,
the pastimes and the history of the stories of Kali are very diverse. So she's supposed to be a personification of Parvati as well. So she's actually the wife of Shiva, but in a different guise, because Shiva gave her little tasks to do, to fight demons and things like that. And to do that, she would take on a different form, a more ferocious form, and then exemplify that ferocity. And that is actually one of the reasons. So if you look at the Kali temple, Kali in Dakshineshwar, that Guruji is standing in front of in this section, she's got her right foot on Shiva. And she's like two of her arms are clean and they're worshipful, like gestures, and the other hands are like bloody with weapons and the head of a demon. So complete contradiction. It's like in India we wouldn't think of putting your foot on a book, let alone a god such as Shiva, and this is her husband. So the story is that to defeat this demon, she had to become so ferocious that she lost control of herself, and she was just destroying everything in her path after destroying this demon. And Vishnu got in. He tried to get involved, but he see that she's basically destroying the whole universe. So even I'm not going to be able to pull her out of this. So he stepped aside, and Shiva, being used a bit more intelligence, because perhaps he knew his wife a bit better than Vishnu did. He thought the only way I can get her out of this state is for her to remind her of her actual what she actually is. So he lay down on the ground before her, and then in India, as I say, is putting your foot on someone is just like sacrilege, and especially if it's your husband or God. So he lay down in front of her, and then she went to destroy him by putting her foot on him. And this is the exact image of the Kali, the temple that we see, and the personifications of Shiva lying there as if dead, but he's actually lying there to try and remind her of her stature. So as soon as she put her foot on Shiva and she remembered, oh my God, this is my husband, what am I doing? This is sacrilege. And then she came back to her senses. And the other things, like she was holding a weapon, and she's bloody. So one of the demons that she was destroying, he was so powerful that he practiced tantra such that he was basically invincible. And this goes a bit similar to Greek mythology. He was invincible, and what happened was, if someone destroyed him, if a drop of blood would fall on the soil, then he would then take up another form, and then he would then go on living in another form. So what Kali did was basically killed him, but didn't let a single drop of his blood go on the ground. So basically sucked in his blood. And this is why you see a bloody version of Kali. So there's all these like various stories, but the tantric interpretation is that like Shiva is like consciousness, and Kali is like the energy, and Kali and Kala is to do with, it's like a homonym, which is two, one word for many different meanings. So Kala means time, Kala also means darkness. So there's many interpretations of that, but Kali is also the energy. So she's the energy, and Shiva is the consciousness. Consciousness can't exist without energy, and hence they're like these two, yin and the yang, as it were, and they're dependent on each other. Hence, Shiva depends on Shakti or Parvati, and vice versa.
Awesome, yeah. It is, as I said at the beginning of this episode, there's so much in here that you could pull apart and really just talk about for a long time. But in the interest of moving on, we'll look at the next part. And as I mentioned, so Yogananda is sharing his puzzled sort of nature at observing Kali and sitting there in thought himself. And we have this rishi who's come up and dropped some truth bombs and talking about God is simple, everything else is complex. And the two of them struck up this conversation. So here we have the response by the rishi, the first response by the rishi to Yogananda's response himself. And he said that there are really few who would solve the mystery of Kali. And he says that good and evil is the challenging riddle which life places sphinx-like before every intelligence. And it's funny, really, he says about riddle, that Kali in the footnote is said to, to devour those who wouldn't be able to solve her riddles. Oh no, forgive me, that's the Sphinx. That's the Sphinx itself. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much for the clarification. So the Sphinx was a fabulous monster of Greek mythology that was represented by the head of a woman, the body of a lion or a dog, and the wings of a bird, and that this creature would propose a riddle to all passersby, and that anybody who did not answer was devoured by this creature. So that's the Greek mythology for you there. So there we have the rishi, using, it's just pure linguistics, isn't it? Beautifully put together, and saying here that good and evil is the challenging riddle which places before every intelligence sphinx-like a challenge. And I just thought, wow, this is really something that struck a chord with me, because aren't we in this world of duality, constantly battling between, making sense of the world and understanding our place within it? and it can get very, very complex. And to the Rishi's point is God is simple. Just put your mind to God, and then everything else sort of melts away. But I thought, okay, this is definitely something we can unpack to a greater extent. And he goes on to say then that men forfeit their lives often, from what I understand it, trying to figure out the riddles of life without making any progress, and that the towering, lonely figures never cries defeat, and that he's referencing, these great spiritual figures that we are very lucky to have in our own SRF lineage, that these individuals would never cry defeat and pursue truth and pursue God over all else and all the complexities of life. That the duality of Maya plucks, as he says, the cleaveless truth of unity. So he just drops so many beautifully strung together sentences and bits of truth for us to pick apart here. But I'll come to sort of reactions first. Priyank, do you want to make a comment?
When he said attempting no solution, most men pay forfeit with their lives. Penalty now, even as in the days of Thebes. I interpreted that as, it's like, how the majority of the population just gives in to the everyday whims of likes and dislikes and the world and illusory world of Maya. So they forfeit their lives in that, and hence, like, everything that's worthwhile you kind of lost because you've already you've gone all in on this pretty shallow hand with low chip count.
Yeah, I mean, I think we actually have pretty high chip count, and we forfeit anyways because Maya is convincing us to do so, right? And I think that might be what he is describing, that even people who are starting to look for God because they feel like they're ready to not be in the world anymore, they're ready to move on from it, but then they start this endeavor, and then at some point Maya finds a way to get them back in. And I think when he says that there is few who are never cry defeat, then those are the people who just keep on keeping on.
Mm-hmm. I thought to myself, is this one of life's greatest challenges? The greatest mysteries, maybe challenging, this riddle of life, this balance between good and evil, understanding this and overcoming this duality, overcoming evil. There's a great quote that Paramahansa wrote in the Bhagavad Gita that we can get to. But before we do, Priyank, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I just want to touch on the towering figures line. So he says, the saint or the rishi says, here and there, a towering, lonely figure never cries defeat. So in my mind, he's describing essentially an avatar. So he's probably describing Mukunda here in front of him. So, this towering, lonely figure. So avatars obviously so few, they kind of almost stand alone. They never cried defeat, and hence their tower above, as an example for us to follow and perhaps seek guidance and support as we do.
Yeah, I did think whenever I read that, the road to mastery of the world of Maya is a lonely one, and I thought, actually, it doesn't need to be. And then, Yogananda's standing there saying, stand strong amongst the crashing of breaking worlds and these things. But then we have the self-realization fellowship, and the key word is fellowship. And I kind of thought that's actually quite nice that Yogananda is there, sure, cutting his way through for the rest of us to then follow. So yes, it may have been a very lonely path, and it may be for each individual at times. I'm sure we all have our own sacrifices and things that we make along the spiritual path. But then we have Yogananda and the gurus to thank for the fellowship that we all have in the self-realization fellowship. So I thought it was nice to note that yes, he probably is talking to Yogananda directly there, the Rishi, but then Yogananda's gone on and created this fellowship, and he's talked about that being very important in the spiritual path, keeping good company. So we do not need to be lonely is the conclusion I drew from that, thanks to Yogananda and the likes. But the Bhagavad Gita then, just moving on to this, back to the topic, sorry, of good and evil. There is a section in the Bhagavad Gita on the commentary by Yogananda, super good read. Chapter 5, verse 15. It's a bit of a long chapter. There's a part of why evil is necessary and inherent in part of God's creation. So if anybody does want to jump in and read it, it's towards the back end of the chapter. It's probably easier to go from chapter 16 and go backwards. But I thought I'd read out this part to hopefully give us a better understanding of why God does actually permit evil, because it is something that I think a lot of us grapple with. So Lauren, maybe would you be kind enough to kick us off?
Love to. It says, good and evil must ever be complements on this earth. Everything created must bear some guise of imperfection. How else could God, the sole perfection, fragment his one consciousness into forms of creation distinguishable from himself? There can be no images of light without contrasting shadows.
And Mike, would you be kind enough to read on?
Unless evil had been created, man would not know the opposite, good. Night brings out the bright contrast of day. Sorrow teaches us the desirability of joy. Though evil must come, woe to him by whom it comes.
He who is enticed by delusion to play the villain's part must suffer the villain's sad karmic state, while the hero receives the hallowed reward of his virtue. Knowing this truth, we must shun evil, becoming good. We ultimately rise to God's high state, beyond both good and evil.
Yeah. So yeah, that's some of the commentary on the Bhagavad Gita from Yogananda. And there is a whole other section that we could go into of Yogananda's take on evil, good and evil, and why it exists and how it came about. This battle that we all go under, and of course the Bhagavad Gita itself is this battle that Arjuna is leading at the time. So we know that we must do battle with it, but ultimately it's all part of the delusion, isn't it? All part of Maya, and I like that bit, that we can rise above it eventually and have unity with God alone. Priyank?
Yeah, and obviously this goes back, evil and Maya are kind of linked. Oh, actually both of them, good and evil. You have to transcend both, transcend Maya, and then become liberated, which brings us to the Guruji's footnote on Maya here, which he quotes Emerson again. Do you want to talk about that, Chris? Or...
No, crack on. That's where we should go.
Yeah, it's really this is one of Emerson's poems that I can read easily, shall we say? It's pretty easy to digest. It's got a lot of rhyming couplets in each of the two lines, which I liked, like impenetrable and innumerable, and never fail, and veil on veil, and believed and deceived. So it's all the dualities are all there in the poem, but it's very nice, the explanation of Maya.
Yeah, and shall we read it out, or is it?
Yeah, you can read it out.
Yeah. Illusion works impenetrable, weaving webs innumerable. Her gay pictures never fail, crowd each other veil on veil. Charmer who will be believed by man who thirsts to be deceived. So yeah, wise words, isn't it? Wise words.
Why
And
are we so thirsty to be deceived, Chris?
it is a question, Brian, I do not have the answer for as yet. One day.
Stop trying to quench your thirst of deception.
Exactly, yeah. Funny, that's actually how I described, when I first got into the lessons, was a thirst of quench. Like my thirst was quenched. Actually, when I got the lessons and started reading the text of Yogananda and the Autobiography of a Yogi, and it's funny that actually, because it's the great deception, isn't it? That the evil promises to quench the thirst, and that's why I think people keep going to it and going to it and going to it, but actually does the opposite. It makes it even thirstier and thirstier and thirstier, and that's the great deception, isn't it? And then eventually, when you do drink from true wisdom that Yogananda and others sort of give us, it's like, wow, like, geez, it's floored me when I first got to it. So thanks to the SRF gurus for that one. So Yogananda then turns to him, and after this great sort of speech that I gave, and he said, you speak with conviction, sir. To Yogananda, I presume that's really, his agreement with what the Rishi said, but at very least he obviously was moved by how the Rishi said it. So we move on then to what the Rishi then said to Yogananda next, and it's very, very insightful. The few paragraphs that we have to read here really are the Rishi expressing that through self-scrutiny actions and relentless observance of one's thought, you can shatter the ego. He says it pulverizes the stoutest ego. And it just reminded me of Sri Yukteswar, and the relationship that Yogananda had with Sri Yukteswar was one that at times was very tough on Yogananda, that he really was having his mind just dissected and his ego dissected by Sri Yukteswar. He was the avatar of wisdom himself. And here is Yogananda before he meets his guru, before he meets this avatar of wisdom. Sri Yukteswar is having some lessons given to him in the same vein. Mike?
Funny that you mentioned Sri Yukteswar in this context, because I always thought that, like, when you do introspection yourself, you are the soul in theory. You're the soul trying to analyze all your tendencies, and you're trying to pick apart soul and ego, right? And then try to find out where things come from. And it's difficult sometimes. And then when you have someone like Sri Yukteswar giving you feedback, that must greatly help doing introspection, right? Because you immediately know what you have to look for, right?
I'd also love to read out, if you don't mind, what he said in fullness here. I feel like it's really instructive for us. So he said, I have long exercised an honest introspection, the exquisitely painful approach to wisdom. Self-scrutiny, relentless observance of one's thoughts, is a stark and shattering experience. And I feel like that is, like I say, so instructive, and it's that pointer to ourselves. How are we relentlessly observing ourselves? Are we relentlessly introspecting? Are we relentlessly shattering this created human self till we become nothing? It's easy to go about our lives and be blinded to this humanness that we need to dissolve. So right there we have it, relentlessly introspect and make changes, and this will pulverize the stoutest ego, and one may become a seer.
It's good that you guys mentioned Sri Yukteswar, because the way he's speaking, it could be one of the Sri Yukteswar chapters, couldn't it? Mm-hmm. The way his phraseology is like he doesn't hide behind nice words. He just says it pretty much as it is. Bruising to the ego treatment he used to Guruji called it, didn't he? And I just wanted to pick up on the first line where it says the honest introspection, which he says is the exquisitely painful approach to wisdom. Why, one wonders, would introspection be painful? Lauren?
I can answer this one. When we honestly introspect, we face the parts of ourselves, our created self, that really is painful and that the ego and the mind does not want to see. But it's only then we can face it for what it is and overcome and make changes. And I can really feel the truth in what he's saying here. Yes, it's painful, but also it's worth it. You know, how else will we be who we actually are unless we learn to go through that painful fire approach of wisdom through intuition and self-analysis. So.
Yeah, I agree with what Lauren just said. I feel whenever there is a delta between who we think we are and what we actually are, the ego constructs a persona of ourselves or a mask. And I think in introspection, we have to pull the mask off, to deconstruct those personas and see things how they really are. And that's, I think it's just painful while you're doing it. Then once you're done with it and you release it, it's all good again. So I don't think you create like like it's sometimes it sounds like, oh, you create all this pain, but actually you don't. You just you make it simple, and after you released all this all those charades, then afterwards you feel much better than before.
I must not be doing it very well then, because I don't feel much pain when I introspect.
Dig a little deeper, Priyank.
Everything's hunky-dory.
I think pain might not be the goal of introspection either. So
Yeah,
maybe it's not always painful. Yeah.
The sheer fact that the word pulverized is used there is not very, it doesn't sound pleasant, does it? So it sounds like, wow, there's a real amount of, let's say, force required to take apart something that's obviously quite resolute in trying to remain as it is. I just looked up, what does the word pulverized mean? I think, I would know, but it's reducing to dust or powder, pounding or grinding, demolish or crush completely. I just thought then that maybe it's this idea of going back to spirit, as it were, to the gross form of matter, like this idea of something takes shape, but then actually going back to our more etherical nature of spirit is something that came to mind there. So maybe it's a bit softer in my understanding than pulverized, and which is a bit harsher. But
you
Lauren?
say that, but it is a death in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Truly, it is. So pulverizing feels quite apt.
The death of the little self. Let's read the part of the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6, verses 5 to 6. There's a couple, it's not too long, but maybe Priyank, you could read what Yogananda really talks about when he talks about the self of the ego versus the self of the soul.
Let man uplift the self, ego, by the self. Let the self not be self-degraded, cast down. Indeed, the self is its own friend, and the self is its own enemy. For him whose self, ego, has been conquered by the self, soul, the self is the friend of the self. But verily the self behaves inimically, as an enemy towards the self that is not subdued.
In the physical ego, the active consciousness has become spiritualized and united to the soul. it is able to keep the intelligence, mind, and senses under control, guided by the discriminative wisdom of the soul, i.e., the self-ego has been conquered by the self-soul. Then the soul is the friend, the guide, and benefactor of the active physical consciousness. But if the lower ego self has not been thus controlled and persists in keeping the consciousness matter bent, then the soul is the enemy of the ego.
Nice, isn't it? Because when I was reading it, this part of the Autobiography of a Yogi, I kind of thought, gosh, this is quite harsh, isn't it? You know, pulverizing the ego and per ego, and there's trying not to have too much sympathy or sympathy for it, yeah. But this encapsulated what I was sort of intuitively feeling. You know, in Yogananda covers so many topics, and this is one that he covers really well. And if it was a bit confusing to listen to it because it was a lot of self this and self that. It's easier when you read it because you see the one self of the souls with the capital S, so you can understand it a little bit more fluently.
Yeah.
So it's encourage you to read that part. Yeah, chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. So there we have it. The friend, the enemy becomes the friend, but remains the enemy if it resists the direction of the soul, the real self that we are. So the Rishi then continues, and this bit is so interesting. And again, you know, we could unpack this so much, but the way of self-expression, he says that the individual acknowledgements comes with it, that results in egotists, and that they have their right to interpret God in their own way, their private interpretations, as he says, and the universe. And Yogananda affirms this. He says, you know, truth humbly retires, no doubt, before such arrogant originality. And I thought, wow, saying that in the United States, if he was there, would be controversial because it's the sort of individual identified nation, isn't it? They love individuality, and it's something that is indeed, you know, good in a sense about the United States. But I thought that it sort of flies in the face of what the United States sort of pushes for in some sense. That the arrogant originality, it sounds like quite strong language, that it hits hard, that Yogananda is simply put saying that you must break down the originality of the ego to be able to unify yourself with God. So yeah, mincing no words, the two of them in this conversation. Lauren?
And I also feel like when he says before, the way of self-expression, individual acknowledgements results in egotists, and so on and so forth. It's that reminder that we should be acknowledging God at all times as the doer and not ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Easily said.
Easier said than done. But
so it's our sadness, isn't it?
Even when we talk about it, there's a kind of duality here, because we're saying, I have to acknowledge God. Well, if there's an I acknowledging God, there's no release then of the ego, because we're saying it's me acknowledging. No, there is no I.
God acknowledging God's self.
Indeed.
That's yeah. So the two of them are having this great conversation, and the Rishi then continues to say that, you know, man is lesser, essentially, that he uses the words the repulsive life of countless world delusions, and that the man struggles on the battlefield pale into insignificance here, that the man first contends with inner enemies, the inner demons that man has, and he really says that the omnipresent unresting, pursuing man, even in sleep. And he uses a beautiful word in the how do you pronounce it? The mesmic, I would say, the mesmic.
Miasmic.
Is it miasmic or not mesmic? Miasmic weapons. I had to look up that word, what it actually meant, and it's somewhat of an ethereal nature, ghostly smoke nature that essentially will pursue you even through matter, that the soldiers of ignorant lust seek to slay us all. And he refers man as thoughtless, that he buries his ideals, surrenders to common fates, that he may seem other than impotent wooden ignoramus. So he's really throwing the kitchen sink at man here, and is very, as he says, to be overcome by a harrowing array of light, that is no mortal foes, that the demons that we face. So he's acknowledging, yes, that we're pursued endlessly, man, by our somewhat ghostly pursuers. But he is indeed saying that we are failing in many instances. Priyank, what's your take on this?
Yeah. When you guys were talking about the little self and, the I, just remembered the quote from SRF: "When this I shall die, then shall I know who am I." It's quite nice. In this paragraph, you just mentioned it, that you must contend with your inner enemies, and he describes them as no mortal foes, and they have to be overcome by, they have to be overcome essentially. And he's essentially saying that the inner enemies are actually greater. They're the worst of the enemies that you have, the most powerful, and you have to be constantly battle with them to try and gain victory, which is true for that's essentially the whole big part of the Bhagavad Gita, is the persistent fight between yourself and yourself, the self versus yourself.
We had a nice meditation at your place, Priyank, and then at the end, you asked me to read a random part of Bhagavad Gita, and it was that part where Arjuna doesn't want to fight his cousins, right? He doesn't want to fight the Kurus, but the Kurus, they represent the evil tendencies or the bodily ego tendencies, right? And some of them have been your long-standing allies, like the senses, for example, that you have been using in your life, and this is the whole thing. That's also the case here. Like, you have to overcome. In the Bhagavad Gita, it's more, the language is different. It's war, and you kind of kill them or you overcome them, but it's the same thing, really.
But here he's describing someone who has given up, essentially. Thoughtless is the man who buries his ideals, surrendering to the common fate. But thankfully, Arjuna did not surrender. He kept on. He re-picked up his famous bow and carried on the fight after temporarily losing his way, shall we say, and Krishna then, urging him, cheerleading him on.
In general, he's saying that self-analysis is the path to wisdom, but how he's saying it is a little harsh. That Yogananda makes a comment on. He said, challenges him. He says, "Respected sir, have you no sympathy for the bewildered masses?" So Yogananda really is taking a step back for a moment to say, hold on, aren't we being a little unjust in how we're referring to our fellow man? Before I go into this, Lauren, do you want to jump in?
Yes, very quickly. For those of you that need a kind of softer approach to the art of introspection, it was very gently and simply put in the Bhagavad Gita commentary from Guruji, where he said, the earnest inquiry, what did they? This is in the first verse, what did they? Is metaphorically the question to be asked by the spiritual aspirant as he reviews daily the events of his own righteous battle, from which he seeks the victory of self-realization. Through honest introspection, he analyzes the deeds and assesses the strengths of the opposing armies of his good and bad tendencies. And that feels a little bit softer and more doable and achievable for those who don't quite resonate with the firm fire approach. So yeah, I'd share that in case it helps anybody.
Thank you, Lauren. It is, I suppose it has been noted before that Yogananda has a very different approach to somebody like Sri Yukteswarji. But all paths lead to God in the end with the sort of gurus. I think we've talked about before, which gurus would you be more, drawn to? And I think I even said probably Sri Yukteswarji to get these kind of heavy hitting, blunt truths that might shake me into action. Maybe there's, some quotes for there's different gurus for everybody. Yogananda certainly has a very loving, divine mother sort of exudes from Yogananda, doesn't it? So here he is challenging this rishi to say, respected sir, have you no sympathy for the bewildered masses? And so the rishi goes silent and he introspects, which he was preaching about, and he comes out with another really impactful few sentences, which really, to summarize it, says that through the love of an invisible God, that man really is revealed through the brotherhood of man. It is revealed that we are all one. So he says that this inner research exposes the unity of man, and that it inevitably brings compassion for one's fellows. And really, Yogananda agrees with him. He says that there's a blind to the healing potencies of the soul awaiting exploration, which really is quite a beautiful statement to say that after you may get over the pure observation of the folly of mankind, you go deeper into the analysis of man and the human minds, the analysis of the human minds, and you see that we all have one brotherhood, we are one, and that inevitably you must have compassion for yourself. So love thyself, as Jesus said, which, as I said, Yogananda agrees with, that every sage or the saints of every age have felt like yourself for the sorrows of the world. So in a sense there, do you think it's something that we would want to avoid, this compassion? Because to have compassion, you would have to then see the unity in all minds and all mankind. And then that would be to having to tear your ego away from the identification with this thing that you're maybe criticizing, in a sense. So it's the step beyond that you have to go to, which in itself is separation from the ego. Is that something we could take away from that?
Perhaps.
Maybe.
It's a very lot to unpack in this paragraph, isn't there? Firstly, the stalwart kinship that you mentioned. I thought this was if you read it, I'll just read the whole thing. But ingenuity is equal to the maze. Inner research soon exposes a unity of all human minds, the stalwart kinship of selfish motive. So it's quite a depressing depressing sentence there, isn't it? In that even though we may not accept that, all of humanity is in brotherhood or sisterhood, in our quality of selfish motive, we're all brothers and sisters. What a depressing state of affairs. But that again, as you said, Chris, that means that for ones which are, introspect a bit deeper and realize that that is not truth, essentially, being selfish, being selfless is the truth, or divine love, selfless love. Then you realize, then you would have compassion for the, the way the other side of the world, the other half of the world lives, or probably not the other half, the majority of the world lives. And compassion is really important in our path, because, and this comes back to, the importance of the worldwide healing service that we partake in, and I do partake in every day, because it builds on that compassion. And also my favorite affirmation about developing compassion is what is it? As I radiate sympathy and goodwill to others, I open the channel for God's love to come to me. Divine love is the magnet that attracts all blessedness. So we have to not just have compassion, but we have to nurture and grow that compassion. And Guruji has given us affirmations and the prayer service and devotion and meditation to come to that noble goal.
I would say you say it's depressing that you then find out that we're all together in the same delusion, kind of. But it's also kind of the one thing that you figure out that makes you feel compassion for everybody, right? Because you are not the only one who is kind of trying to find out what truth is. Everyone is, and everyone has to go through similar tests in life. And I guess in that sense, you this whole thing, this kinship, this brotherhood, kind of, you could almost see it like we're in this together. And in when you are with other spiritual souls who are seekers, then you kind of feel this a little bit, right? That we're all in this and we're all trying to get out of it slowly. And I think that's a really nice thought.
The sadhu does soften. Yogananda described his face as noticeably have softened. And he says, only the shallow man loses responsiveness to the woes of others' lives as he sinks into the narrowing suffering of his own. And that really was something that compelled, Buddha, when he kind of left his own sort of palace and he saw the suffering of others, and that compelled him really to go on to this introspective journey that ultimately led him to enlightenment. So inevitably, this is an extremely powerful lesson and conversation of why Yogananda is taking the time to include this in the autobiography as he's doing. Priyank?
Yeah, and his young Mukunda's response to this saint sadhu in relating all this was, the saints of every age, sir, have felt like yourself the sorrows of the world. And if you really delve deep into that, you can see the words from God's boatman now, how Guruji himself comes back again and again, doesn't he? Because he sympathizes for our sorrows and mankind's woes.
Yeah, he describes it as universal pity. The Rishi says, the one who practices a scalpel self-dissection will know an expansion of universal pity. Wow, and it's a very profound statement, isn't it? That's been given here. Do you know something actually that struck me as I was reading this part in the chapter? I thought to myself, well, did Yogananda take note of this? this is a conversation happening many years before he wrote the Autobiography of a Yogi. And here he is reciting these conversations, as if they're currently happening, as if they're just happened yesterday. And even if they just happened yesterday, how many of us would be able to recite them, what you imagine to be quite an accurate recitement of the conversation? We're not talking about any old individual, we're talking about an avatar, and you can probably jump into the Akashic records and pull out the word for word aspect of it. But it struck me as profound in and of itself that we're able to relive this conversation with him in the manner that we're doing.
That's true. And you'll remember that in Guruji's Samadhi poem, one of the lines was, "Thoughts of all men, past, present, and to come, are all right there with him in that moment of his Nirvikalpa Samadhi that he experienced." So so he can go back in time, just exactly as you're saying in the Akashic records, Chris, and copy and paste, shall we say?
Yeah,
with auto translate as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I thought. So we have the Rishi saying what universal pity, and that releasing of the ego is, as he says, release is given him from the deafening demands of his ego. And goes on to say, why, Lord, why? By ignoble whips of pain, man is driven at last into the infinite presence, whose beauty alone should lure him. So we've got a quite clear put statement there that it's through the whips of pain that drives mankind into the infinite presence, into God's bosom, as it were. But what I've taken from this is that whilst like that is true, that the beauty alone should be able to lure. So we don't have to go through the pain, but we do anyway, just because we're partaking in Maya endlessly. Priyank?
Yeah, just one line in the midst of all that gold dust was super gold dust in my mind, where we he talked about compassion and humility, and then the universal pity. Guruji then adds in there this lovely line: "The love of God flowers on such soil." What a powerful thought. But the next line about the "Why, Lord, why?" I can certainly remember those same questions at the mere age of 18, I would say. Troubling relationships led me to pick up the Gita, and thankfully I went away from emotional turmoil from that day, and have them much less frequently now, shall we say. So yeah, I can certainly resonate with that question and the pain that causes that question to come about, whether it's emotional or psychological or physical even.
So, Lauren?
I can relate to Priyank, yeah. But I also love this last line where he says, he's talking about the infinite presence, and he says, whose beauty alone should lure him. And Guruji talks about that, the love of God should be the only thing that lures us, nothing else, not what we can gain, not what this human self is selfishly wanting from God. It's the love, it's the beauty of him alone that should draw our hearts. And it's just so much instruction in this whole section. It feels like scripture, it really does. And we could delve into this for hours, I feel. There's so much to take away.
There's universal truth in a lot of it. And I think one line just to go back to that I did want to dwell on a little bit more was only the shallow man loses responsiveness to the woes of others' lives and he sinks into narrow suffering of his own. I thought to myself, how often do we fall into that trap? Myself, guilty, mischarged, being known to do that myself. And I think it's a very common issue. How many times do we lose our patience and compassion, unity with our fellow man, even triggered into anger, frustration, dealing with people. It's not easy in and of itself. That's why it's a challenge that we all take. And I was doing some searching, and I thought maybe we could read out. There's a talk in a 2004 convocation by Brother, again, I don't want to mispronounce it, but
Achalananda.
Achalananda. Mike, would you be kind enough to kick us off and read what was said there?
Dealing with anger, calmness, and patience are the spiritual qualities we must develop, as well as learning to accept unpleasant experiences and not be upset by them. There will always be unpleasant situations caused by other people, so don't become upset or angry. One of the brothers said it took him 8 years to overcome anger. He was always losing it. He kept praying to Master, "You have to help me with this." Then the idea came to him to pray for the other individual, to pray for those who were pushing his buttons. When you pray that way, brother said, a very interesting thing happens. You find that you have to give up one or the other. You can't keep feeling bad about them when you pray for them. It may or may not affect the other person, but it will change you.
Lauren, would you be?
To say,
Yep.
Don't become discouraged if the results aren't immediate. Keep on keeping on, and eventually you will see that you don't react as you used to. You will realize that your consciousness has changed. After Brother came back from his trip to India, some of the devotees at Lake Shrine told him, "You've changed." Brother said that something happened while he was in India which helped him to open up to love and compassion and understanding.
Something that did just occur to me, that why we cherish the guru disciple guru relationship so much is, again, open to conversation, is the devotion, or rather the compassion, the unity that the guru identifies with us, and so that we value that so highly, because it's not over this lifetime, it's lifetimes. But the compassion and this maybe the pity, as this rishi described as, but that's there in the guru for us, and it takes us maybe a while to kind of recognize that. But we work on that, but it's already there in the guru. It's such a strong bond, that love and compassion that lasts lifetimes, that the guru is going to be there to kind of bring us home. So it's maybe what is at the back end of that relationship that we cherish so much, so therefore so powerful. So we can look towards the rishi's response, that thereafter the conversation sort of stops about these insights into self-analysis and unity and compassion, and we have the bricks and mortar comment from the rishi. So they're the two of them looking upon
Chris,
Calcutta.
should we do that? I think we should do that in the next episode. We're stretching over 90 minutes now.
Do you want to cover it in the next episode? Sure.
Yeah, that's all right.
That's absolutely fine. Well, then, with that part of the chapter done, does anybody have anything else to add? Anything else that we want to cover?
It was really heavy, wasn't it? It's really it's like prepping us for 3 Yogadeshwara episodes, isn't it, to come? Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's heavy and it came out of nowhere. Like he just randomly meets a sadhu and he speaks in poems, really drops some really deep truth on us, and that make us think a lot.
Yeah, we didn't want to do it a disservice by sort of pushing through quickly, but we probably pushed through quickly enough that yeah, we could do multiple episodes on this part alone. Lauren?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. Like, it might feel heavy, but I would also encourage everyone to try and find the lightness in it, because truth does set us free, and there is so much truth in here. And yes, the mind may not be able to comprehend it perhaps right now, but we can meditate deeply upon these words and realize these truths in our own lives, I feel, and it won't feel heavy. It will feel as light as God himself. So yeah, just a little word of encouragement for anyone who may be feeling weighted down by this. There's freedom in truth.
Taking inspiration from your reading there. Don't become discouraged. Keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
There you go.
I started doing something in this episode actually, which is to actually write in the autobiography of a yogi. So I've started highlighting sections. So what I highlighted here, and it really helped me follow this, is I've just highlighted when Mukunda is speaking and when the saint is speaking, because then that splits up everything into nice little 3 or 4 chunks. So I think I may follow this protocol through the whole book, especially when there's big conversations where they're both giving some insight. Especially, I think that might help for later episodes. But there's a bit of a sacrilege there, because in India, you're never supposed to scribble on scripture type books.
Oh dear, no one would like to read my Bhagavad Gita then. Notes upon notes.
Well, with that said, then, thanks for joining us today. Thanks to you all for your insights and contributions. And we'll start off where we left off on the next episode. So join us then. Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.